Just a few months into the Revolutionary War, a plan was developed to invade Canada, to rally French-Canadian support against the British and entice Canada as a possible 14th colony. What events led to the creation of the Canadian Campaign? Who was in charge? And what were the details for the invasion? And what happened at the Battle of Montreal? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the Canadian Campaign of the Revolutionary War, and we're going to focus on the strategic setting and the start of General Montgomery's march from Fort Ticonderoga in the summer and fall of 1775. And joining me for this discussion is Army Historian Steve Elliott. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So Steve has taught history at Rutgers University. He served as editor of the Journal of New Jersey Studies, worked as a CMH historian since 2020, and he holds a PhD in history from Temple University and is the author of Surviving the Winters, Housing Washington's Army During the Revolution, which was awarded the 2023 Harry M. Ward Book Prize. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And he's also authored 2 volumes in CMH's Campaigns of the American Revolution War series, a series that's going to be a total of 13 volumes. And so, Steve, which volumes did you write?
So I wrote the New Jersey Campaign, 1776 to 77. So that's the Trenton and Princeton battles to most people. And then Northern Campaigns, which covers the war in New Jersey, New York, New England from 1778 to 1781. So a lot of actions that tend to get forgotten, but get covered in that work. Yeah,
well, great. And, we're going to be doing podcasts on those as well. So we'll have you back to talk about those. But for this podcast and the next one, so this is going to be like a 2-part series that we're going to focus on the Canadian Campaign. So just to get people to understand the strategic setting and where we are in time. So by July of 1775, a lot has already happened in the war. We've had the battles of Lexington and Concord in April, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, upstate New York, in May, the establishment of the Continental Army on June 14th of 1775, and of course the Battle of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, which is also in June. But now the Army is looking to Canada. So can you explain why? Bring us up to date. What's the idea for this?
So I think to start off, we need to know a little bit about Canada itself, since this is where this campaign is going to unfold. So through most of the colonial era, what we now consider Canada, particularly the part that's going to be fought over in these campaigns, was a French colony up through 1763 when it was taken over by the British at the end of the French and Indian War. But even in 1775, so about a decade later, the population of Canada, really the province of Quebec, which is what we're focusing on here, was about 110,000 people, which was not a whole lot. Roughly the same population as New Jersey at the time. It's a much smaller colony than this massive entity that was Quebec. So it's very sparsely inhabited, 110,000 people. Majority of them are French-speaking, what we refer to as habitants. So these sort of French, almost semi-feudal peasants living in the St. Lawrence Valley. They're also referred to as quote-unquote new subjects because they are new subjects of the King of England, or King of Great Britain, since the conquest in 1763. And then there's a handful of folks that we are sort of referred to as old subjects. So these are English-speaking people, merchants and landowners that kind of come in after the English conquest, imperial administrators, and a number of farmers and merchants from the English-speaking colonies, people from New England and New York, et cetera. So that's the population on the ground in Canada at the time. As you alluded to in your intro, when the revolution breaks out, there are folks in the revolutionary government, the American Continental Congress, that envision Canada as a potential 14th colony. This idea that we've got our 13 colonies here, why not add the one just north of our borders? And that's kind of where the germ of this idea of opening a campaign in Canada starts. There's a political element to it. There's also a more traditional operational military consideration. And that is that throughout the colonial era, Canada had been a center for warfare against the English-speaking colonies. So there'd been a series of wars against France during the late 17th and 18th centuries. And all of those conflicts had a colonial theater, and most of those campaigns had witnessed operations between the St. Lawrence Valley, so Quebec or Canada, and New England and upstate New York. In fact, a good number of the folks we're going to be talking about, and people that are familiar in the revolutionary story, had served in, say, the Champlain Valley or the Great Lakes area or the St. Lawrence Valley during the French and Indian War just a decade and change beforehand. So all of that means that when the revolution breaks out, a lot of American leaders with good memories can look to the past and say, hey, we were frequently subject of invasions and raids launched out of places like Montreal and Quebec. So why don't we try to kick the British out of those places before they can use them as a staging ground or a base of operations against the colonies? And to sort of add to that, Canada is fairly weakly held at the start of the revolution. And I can talk a little bit more about British forces in a little bit, but it's really this sort of target of opportunity idea, right? It's, well,
for the Americans to
right.
Canada, yeah.
Right. We might get attacked out of this place that has a history of being used as a base of operations. So maybe we can go and grab it while it's still lightly defended. And then on top of that, it's, oh yeah, it's got this population that might be interested in becoming part of our little project here, which is in 1775, not even called the United States yet and has not even declared independence yet. But, you know, those sentiments are rising. How a colony that was overwhelmingly French-speaking and Catholic and had very little contact with sort of Anglo institutions like the other 13 colonies had, that is a big question, and that's going to come into play later on.
You mentioned some of these leaders who participated in the French and Indian War, but other events in that area. So we know that there's a political interest in going up there, but from the operational standpoint, the military side, who is it that started to come up with these ideas? And first of all, who were they? Can you provide some background on them and the plan?
So, as you mentioned, early part of the war, Americans seized Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, which is essentially getting near the Canadian border, and that's where a lot of these ideas are going to coalesce. So by the summer of 1775, Congress has set up a command structure in the northern part of New York there. So a key figure in this campaign is going to be Major General Philip Schuyler. So Schuyler in 1775 was 42 years old, around the same age as Washington. He's a member of an elite New York family. So there's Schuylers going back generations into the 18th century. There'll be prominent Schuyler descendants going into the 19th century. Later on, Alexander Hamilton will become his son-in-law. So folks that are familiar with Hamilton through the Broadway play and whatnot, there's a connection here. It's that same family, the Schuylers. Anyway, so he's very wealthy, very well connected. He had served in the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. in the same region, in the Lake Champlain Valley, in what's now upstate New York, primarily as a supply officer. So he was more involved in logistics than tactics or anything on the battlefield itself. But as hopefully a lot of our listeners know, logistics wins wars, right? So
right.
This is not something to be dismissed.
Right.
Also experienced in what we might call frontier diplomacy. So again, this is at a time when you've got the colonies, you've got Native American nations, you've got colonists who don't really subscribe to one colony or another and are kind of just living as independent frontiersmen. So there's a lot of different parties involved in any of these campaigns, and Schuyler has experience engaging with all those different groups. So in terms of somebody at a kind of theater command level, he is actually pretty well suited. Unfortunately, his health is very poor, and it quickly becomes apparent that he's not going to be the type of person that's going to lead an expedition at the head of a column into Canada. So that brings our second major figure into the picture here, and that is Richard Montgomery. So Montgomery is 37 years old at the time, so a bit younger than Schuyler, but much more robust, as we'll see, much more of a lead from the front kind of commander. Irish-born, of Ulster Scots extraction, so a kind of complicated background, but had been in New York for a while by 1775, had served as a delegate to the Provincial Congress of New York, so also involved in the local political scene, had served in the British Army and reached the rank of captain before leaving the service because advancement was hard in the British Army. So actually had a good bit of military experience in the 7 Years' War. He had also served in New York on the frontier and also gone to the Caribbean as well. So pretty well traveled. And as we'll see, he's going to feature prominently in the expeditions the Americans send northward. So overall, you've got a good mix of administrative experience from Schuyler's background and then also combat experience from Montgomery.
So between the two of them, are they the ones that really drafted the plan for the invasion?
Yeah, and are going to be executing it, once things get going. As with anything during this time period, though, it's something of a decentralized authority. So you've got congressional committees sending letters back and forth that are, again, really hung up on this idea of a 14th colony. General Washington is commander-in-chief of the Army, but he's mostly in Boston area and focused on the blockade of that city and the principal British garrison. So he's involved to an extent and is going to be featuring a little bit more in the second part of the story.
Okay.
But again, it's Schuyler and Montgomery are kind of the two main characters.
Okay. All right, great. And I know Benedict Arnold was involved to some degree, and we're going to talk about him more in the second episode. But at this point, what was his role in all of this?
So Arnold had showed up at Fort Ticonderoga right at essentially the start of the war in May 1775 and was a participant in the capture of that fort. He was from Connecticut. There was a significant Connecticut presence in the early part of that campaign as well. But it seems that he essentially got sidelined by the summer of 1775 and went back to Boston to confer with Washington and hatch this idea for a second prong of the invasion towards Quebec through Maine that we'll, again, cover in the second podcast there.
Okay, good. So he's already kind of involved, and it's interesting that you noted that he was sidelined. I think the first of a few of those that's going to upset him.
Yeah, not someone you want to slight, but people kept doing it, and
foreshadowing future events here.
Yes,
but the first of those, so that's interesting. All right, so now we got a good idea, and then how many forces did Schuyler and Montgomery have under them as they're about to launch the invasion?
So during the summer and early fall of 75, there are troops dispatched to upstate New York. What's originally referred to as the Separate Army, to kind of separate it from other continental forces operating elsewhere, but will later kind of just be known as the Northern Army, and that tends to be the phrase that you see most associated with it. It's a mix of troops from a number of different areas. So you've got 4 New York regiments, 2 Connecticut regiments, troops from Massachusetts, kind of more regular forces from New Hampshire, a artillery company out of New York City, about 1,800 troops by August, representing 6 different colonies, plus some Canadian recruits. So you had folks across the border in province of Quebec in Canada that got wind of what was going on in the colonies with this revolutionary activity and were actually interested in making Canada a 14th colony and did kind of come south to enlist in the Army as well. Out of that force, so again, about 1,800, you had Connecticut troops, which had more experience. Again, some of them might have taken part in the Ticonderoga expedition. A lot of them were French and Indian War veterans as well. The New York troops were a little bit greener, and we have a quote here from General Montgomery that referred to them as, quote, sweepings of New York streets.
Oh, wow.
So again, kind of the riffraff coming off the streets of New York City is how he viewed it. Adding even more color to the story, you had about 500 troops from what's now Vermont, and at the
Which
time,
didn't exist at the time.
Right. Vermont was not yet a state. It was, in some ways, a sort of independent territory. It was disputed territory between New Hampshire and New York. So there's about 500 troops of what was known as the Green Mountain Boys, so kind of a local military force that had taken part in the capture of Fort Ty. Ethan Allen is kind of the figure that's most closely associated with him, but he was actually not as well looked upon by his contemporaries as later history would make out. So by this point, they're actually under a much more level-headed commander named Seth Warner. So again, a really mixed force.
And then because of that mix, there were some rivalries going on. There was different levels of training. So how did Montgomery and Schuyler approach this? Yeah,
so they're going to be spending a good amount of time in that late summer trying to get this army into some sort of order and shape. One of the things that really comes out from studying this is the logistical issues. Again, they're far north of New York. They're pretty far away from a lot of the major population settlements. So getting supplies to that area can be tricky. And there's a lot of discussions of shortages of shoes, blankets, kettles, tents, before we even get into things like weapons and gunpowder. So this is where Schuyler's administrative acumen really comes in, and his business contacts. So he knows blacksmiths and cobblers and all the little artisans and craftsmen scattered throughout the Northeast that are going to be the people you contract with to get these supplies. And then transportation is the other big issue, right? So there's not a great road network in upstate New York at the time. So a lot of transportation, as well as operations, when we get to that, are going to be waterborne. Getting boats to bring stuff up the Hudson and then portaging it over to Lake Champlain.
Were they making any boats at that time, or were they bringing it all in?
There's essentially these small shipwrights operating on the shores of, say, Lake Champlain or the Upper Hudson, making boats out of essentially green wood, which is leaky and doesn't necessarily make for the best boat, but they were using whatever they had and kind of in a rush to get this all done. So by late summer, early fall, you have a American force that's still pretty green, but is starting to come into shape. They've started to build up supplies and equipment. enough where they might actually be able to say, hey, we've got a shot at making this Canadian campaign actually happen.
What is their first their first objective in this? We call this the Canadian Campaign or the Battle of Quebec, but they weren't going directly to Quebec, right?
Right. So again, getting back to the water aspect of this, lines of advance are going to be along major waterways, and
which ones?
So Fort Ty is on Lake Champlain, which if you have a map in front of you listening at home, you hopefully can see it's a very long, narrow lake on a north-south orientation. Yeah. And that essentially networks with the Hudson River going southward all the way to New York City, and the Richelieu River, which flows into the St. Lawrence right by Montreal, which was one of the major settlements of Canada. So it's essentially this highway of invasion back and forth. You can either march south from Montreal and head into New York, or you can march north up Lake Champlain directly to Montreal. So controlling the lake, which is going to involve, as we've already talked about a little bit, shipping and essentially a naval campaign. And then proceeding down the river to Montreal itself is going to be the first objective here. Just to maybe backtrack a little bit and talk about Canadian geography. So most of those 110,000 residents in Quebec are living in the St. Lawrence Valley, which kind of runs diagonally northeast to southwest. And then west of there is the Great Lakes, which are sparsely inhabited by European settlers, but have a large indigenous population that is networked into this whole story through trade and diplomacy. So essentially, if you can capture Montreal, you can cut off trade and supplies going westward to the Great Lakes and secure that kind of highway running from New York through the Lake Champlain and up to Montreal. So Montreal is a pretty important strategic objective, and that's going to be the Americans' first task, is to try and seize Montreal. But to do that, they need to proceed up Lake Champlain. They need to overcome any British naval or ground forces, and then move on to the city itself.
So before we get into the actual invasion, let's address that. What were the British forces looking like there? How were they arrayed? Who were their leaders? What did they have in the area? So if we had 1,800 coming up with Montgomery, what were they facing?
Canada is very lightly defended at this point. The British were moving troops into the 13 colonies proper with a sort of expectation that this revolutionary sentiment was going to boil over at some point. So Canada, again, a pretty ripe target. At the time, the British commander in Quebec and Canada is Guy Carleton, who's 33 years old, also a veteran of the 7 Years' War, pretty much like everyone we're talking about here. So he'd served at Louisbourg and Quebec in that conflict, and is described by one historian as reserved and level-headed. Maybe not a military genius, but somebody who was not going to commit a lot of mistakes or get himself into trouble. But again, he had not a whole lot to work with at the start of this campaign. In fact, in 1774, he had sent 2 regiments of foot to Boston to help garrison that town, leaving him with only 3 regiments in all of Canada. And they're scattered in outposts from Quebec City all the way out to what's now Michigan. So there's only about 700 regular British troops in the St. Lawrence Valley, split between Montreal, Quebec City, and Trois-Rivières. So very lightly defended. Remember, we've got 1,800 American troops. Again, they're facing 700 British regulars, so redcoats recruited mostly in Britain or Europe. They've got 500 provincials, which are locally recruited, but sort of kept under arms for a longer period, so have a chance of some decent training. And then a militia, so essentially just temporary troops raised locally, which was viewed as almost wholly unreliable. In fact, when they attempted to call out the militia in Quebec City at the start of the war, only 70 people turned out.
Oh, wow.
And those were all what we call the old subjects, so English-speaking people, fairly small community, so weren't a lot of them to go around. The new subjects, the French-speaking population, almost rebelled when they were called out for militia service. There was just this view among a lot of the habitants that this is not their war.
Right.
This is a quarrel between English-speaking people over strange English legal customs and governance, and they just wanted to go and farm their wheat and go to church and that sort of thing. So a lot of them kept aloof of this. Last but not least, we have the indigenous population.
Yeah.
So throughout 17th and 18th centuries, when the French controlled Canada, they made alliances with a lot of the indigenous tribes in the area, either to keep them neutral or to use them as allies in wars against the British. And once the British took over Canada, that relationship persists. So during the Revolutionary War, it's going to be the British operating out of Canada that are trying to cultivate indigenous support, because now they're kind of on the defensive.
And these were mainly Iroquois?
So what we call the Haudenosaunee or Six Nations of the Iroquois. There's also a Seven Nations of Canada, which is another one of these sort of indigenous leagues of peoples. But in the early part of the war, both sides, meaning the Americans and the British Crown, really sought to keep these groups neutral. There was a sense that, again, this was a quarrel between Crown and colonies, and it's more trouble than it's worth to get indigenous peoples involved on one side or another. Again, the British were afraid that sort of launching attacks by, say, the Iroquois or other groups would lead to atrocities and sort of escalate the conflict beyond where they wanted it to go. And for the Americans, who usually didn't have great relations with indigenous people to begin with, it was just, again, if we can keep them neutral, that's good enough for us.
Yeah.
So there'll be some Indian guides and occasional Indian raids in the early part of the campaigns, but not as prominently featured here as they will be in later frontier conflicts.
So we had a good idea of what they had on both sides. But did the British, they were anticipating this invasion, I would imagine. So were they able to, Carleton, did he try to get more reinforcements?
So there's going to be a massive British reinforcement expedition that's going to be sent to relieve Canada. But gathering that back in Britain and sailing it across the Atlantic is going to take a lot of time. Remember, it can take 6 weeks to 3 months to get messages back and forth to Europe. And then specifically with the Canadian context, it gets cold in Canada in the winter. So the St. Lawrence essentially freezes up and shuts down all maritime communication throughout the winter. So one of the real strategic imperatives for the Americans is this sort of race against the clock, where they're going to need to try and take Canada before the ice melts at the end of winter, because then, massive fleet of British ships and reinforcements is going to show up, and that's pretty much going to shut down any realistic chance of them actually taking Canada. So that's kind of the big strategic picture.
So that'll come into play more later on.
Yeah, but it's just important to keep in mind that the time is not necessarily on the American side.
Yeah.
In the near term, the British are going to be using their experience and skill with ship construction to try and build up their naval forces on Lake Champlain. Because essentially, if you can build a fleet on the lake, Canada is invulnerable to attack. Because any force trying to move up the lake is going to be vulnerable to having their supplies interdicted by whoever controls the water. So essentially, a lot of this campaign, even though it's fought upstate New York, a place we usually think of as a arena of land warfare, there's a surprising amount of essentially naval combat and sort of a naval mindset coming into these campaigns.
So let's talk about the actual invasion. Schuyler, I guess, isn't going to join the invasion. It's going to be led by Montgomery. One of the things that comes to mind is, what about cannon for the American side? I know the British had a lot of cannon, but how did the Americans stand with cannon?
Yeah, so they have one company of New York artillery. So essentially people that had drilled with cannons pre-war as like a militia company, and then come into the Continental Service. But it's going to be an issue throughout, not only for the naval side of things, again, not having enough guns to essentially outfit these warships they're trying to build, but later on when they get into Canada proper, not having adequate artillery to batter down the walls of fortified towns. So yeah, that's going to be something that inhibits the Americans later. Also makes it more imperative to essentially win in the field if they can, because a prolonged siege for any of these towns is not necessarily going to be viable. They do have the benefit of having captured artillery at Fort Ty, but a lot of that is going to get sent to Boston to help with the blockade / siege of that town.
The noble train of artillery that would go from Fort Ty down to Boston.
Right. So again, I think that helps illustrate too that these are multiple campaigns being waged in a very expansive conflict. So Congress can't send all of its resources to the Canadian campaign because they're worrying about the Boston campaign, fortifying the coast in case the British land at Charleston, like they try to do later on as well.
All right, so let's talk about the actual invasion. When does Montgomery set out? What are some of the biggest challenges in getting to Montreal?
So the invasion, if we call it that, actually has its preliminary in August of 1775, when the Americans get word that the British are beginning to construct warships, kind of on the far northern shore of Lake Champlain. So as we've talked about, without naval control of the lake, you're not going to have a successful campaign. So the real impetus for the campaign, starting when it does, is essentially the Americans trying to use their land power, unleash their 1,800 troops across the border and get at this British base at the town of Saint Jean, where they're building these ships and kind of basing their defense on. So Montgomery builds up a small fleet of gunboats, so not very large vessels, but the best the Americans can manage with their limited supply of good timber and shipwrights, move up to the northern end of the lake, and then essentially try to besiege this town of Saint John, where the British are tending to build up their fleet. They declare themselves liberators as they cross the border. So again, this idea that this invasion has a political dimension to it, is thinking about adding Canada as a 14th colony, giving support to a likely minority of Canadians that are in favor of joining with the colonies. But if the Americans can gain military success, if they can sort of defeat the British and prove that they have the military prowess to make this independence project work, there's a better chance that more Canadians might come on their side. So it's sort of this two-sided coin, right? The more military successful you are, the more Canadians support you. The more Canadians support you, the more success you're going to have on the battlefield. So there's a lot riding on the early part of the campaign here. Unfortunately, they get to St. John, and not a whole lot of the local population turns out to support the Americans, not only by enlisting, but even just sort of coming forward with support in the form of food and shelter and that sort of thing. So the first foray against St. John essentially ends as soon as it starts. They're not really welcomed by cheering crowds and that sort of thing, so they turn back. Then sort of one problem after another crops up. There's bad weather in the form of rain, contrary winds on Lake Champlain, which delay supplies. Morale kind of goes downhill pretty quickly. Again, you got a lot of soldiers serving in their first campaigns far away from home, instead of the, imagined glory of a battlefield victory. They're just kind of digging ditches in the mud in upstate New York. So a lot of soldiers like, this is not really what I signed up for. So the initial campaign does not really go very successfully. Ethan Allen shows up again and essentially tries to go and attack Montreal. So penetrates deeper into enemy lines and is quickly repulsed and is kind of reveals that as not a very successful idea. So it's essentially a learning process. The Americans discover that, we need to be a bit more systematic about how we go about this. Right. So this is, again, where Schuyler's skill as an administrator comes in and more supplies are built up. They sort of redouble their training efforts. They make more extensive reconnaissance of St. John and get a better picture of the defenses.
Good military tactics.
So again, this is the first couple months of a long war for a country that's in the process of being born. So they don't get everything right on the first try, but there is a pretty rapid figuring it out period here. So after that, Montgomery gets reinforcements. They move back into Canada to attack St. John. This is now like the third or fourth attempt, depending on how you're keeping track. And this goes more successfully. American cannons succeed in sinking a British warship. They grab supplies from the surrounding area. They occupy enemy outposts and close in on St. John, which has now been defended for several months and has been now cut off from supplies and whatnot. So St. John falls on the 3rd of November of 1775. So it was essentially 48 days from the start of the campaign until the Americans captured St. John. So in some ways, this is one of the first big American victories since the very early days of the war. They take 600 British prisoners, a not insubstantial amount, and they wreck the under construction warships and capture the hulls and whatnot. So a clear success, at least at the tactical level for the Americans. Some scholars, though, might argue that in a operational or strategic sense, it was a British victory.
Really?
Well, 48 days lost in terms of the campaign season. So that sets the American timetable back quite a ways. We talked a little bit earlier about how time is not necessarily on the American side, not only in the long term, because we know that British relief force is going to be coming in the spring, but in the near term, a lot of those 1,800 soldiers that Montgomery has with him have short-term enlistments, and a lot of those expire at the new year.
Oh, wow.
So, St. John falls on 3 November. That's only leaves about 2 months until a lot of that army has it in their rights to go home. And as we'll see, there's attempts made to get some men to stay on, but that's no guarantee. So essentially, you have an army with only a 2-month lifespan left by the time St. John falls. That doesn't leave a whole lot of time to conclude the campaign. So long story short, it's a impressive kind of tactical victory for the Americans. Its operational and strategical consequences are a little bit more debatable.
So after St. John, when do they move on towards Montreal?
Basically immediately. Because again, there's not no time to be wasted here.
So the time is of the essence here.
Exactly. So Montgomery knows that these impending enlistment expirations are coming up. He promises to his soldiers, and this is, I think, where Montgomery's reputation as somebody that was a very hands-on commander, a very active commander, and one who is sensitive to how to motivate his men. He essentially tells his soldiers that he's willing to discharge them early if Montreal falls. So he's like, well, I need to capture Montreal. If we can do that in the next week or two, I don't need you all through the end of the year, so you can go home early. So let's kind of get it together and
home by
march
Christmas.
on up. Yep, very much so. So again, Montreal is in some ways the key to this part of the campaign. If you hold Montreal, it's a major settlement, so there's a political dimension to it again. You sort of prove that you're capable of holding an important part of Canada. It cuts off the flow of supplies to British garrisons and potential indigenous allies to the west, secures upstate New York, and will be a springboard for the next stage of the campaign, which is Quebec City, which we'll talk about next time. So, all that being said, Americans advanced despite bad weather, despite kind of choppy waters on the Richelieu River. They make it to the St. Lawrence River on 11 November. It's really just a week after the fall of St. Jean. They cross the river and essentially surround Montreal. They promise the civilian population no harm will come to them. Again, sieges can occasionally get out of hand and turn ugly for the civilians, and the Americans are very keen on the hearts and minds aspect of this campaign. The British, meanwhile, realize that they are in a pretty hopeless position at Montreal itself.
Yeah, I was going to say, how well defended was Montreal?
Yeah, at this point, Carleton has very few troops left. Again, a lot of them were at St. John, which has surrendered. And he's, again, realizes that from his perspective, it's more important to hold Quebec City, which is further downriver, closer to the coast, so closer to where that relief fleet is going to show up. And, history had shown that if you could hold out at one, you could always go and capture the other later, that being Montreal and Quebec. So he essentially abandons the town, sails down the St. Lawrence River, and heads to Quebec itself. The Americans were able to impede that evacuation to an extent. So they set up shore batteries on either side of the St. Lawrence to fire on British ships as they moved down the river. So the Americans win a not unsubstantial victory at Montreal. The British are forced to dump 900 barrels of gunpowder into the St. Lawrence River rather than bring it with them. And 11 ships are captured, either in Montreal or along the river, and 150 prisoners are taken. So not a glorious victory, but again, seizing a major town in the heart of an enemy-held province is no small matter.
And I'm guessing those ships are going to come into play later on.
To an extent. The St. Lawrence is the highway of Quebec or of Canada. So the more ships you control, the more resources you have for moving supplies and troops around. So that essentially brings this part of the campaign to an end. The Americans are in control of Montreal by late November. Some of the American troops will stay on. Some will get their early dismissals from Montgomery. Supplies are coming up from the south due to Schuyler's administrative acumen.
And reinforcements also, is it? Or
yeah, so again, you've got some soldiers going home because of the expiring enlistments, but then you've got new recruits coming in. And, maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about what's going on in Canada now that you have the Americans there in force. So with Montreal taken, there's kind of a question of what do you do with the civilian governance side of things. Sort of in the winter, Congress will actually send delegates up to Canada to try and negotiate with the locals there and essentially see what they want to do in terms of becoming part of this larger American project. Canadians, even the ones that are maybe a little bit more pro-revolutionary, still hold off on creating a 14th colony government or sending delegates of their own to a Continental Congress. So that's all going to be up in the air. From a military perspective, you start to see a larger number of Canadians volunteering for service in what's now the Continental Army. In fact, Canadian named James Livingston actually recruits what will become the first Canadian regiment of the Continental Army.
Oh, wow.
So essentially hundreds of Canadians turning out for service in the American Army. Civilians start coming forward with more supplies. So again, that idea of capturing an important strategic objective like Montreal starts to convince the civilian population of the viability of the campaign. The sort of third city of Quebec, which is Trois-Rivières, so downriver from Montreal, but not quite all the way to Quebec City, actually recognizes American control of them. So
they were under American control, not British control at that point.
Yeah, again, the British essentially
just
pull everybody back to Quebec.
Okay.
So essentially, the rest of the province as nominal American control.
Okay.
But, it's a big place. There's very few boots on the ground, so how much that actually comes into play in a lot of places is unclear. Montgomery gets about 800 veterans of his force to reenlist, so they don't all go home. Again, another benefit of a successful campaign is that morale boost. Some he kind of guilts, and he says, like, hey, you made it this far. Don't you want to see it through till the end?
Yeah.
Others they bribe with cash bonuses and offers of new clothes and equipment, and that seals the deal. So 800 veterans is not an insubstantial force.
Right.
In terms of diplomacy, Montgomery promises to respect Catholicism, something that's very important to the French population. He sends some envoys out to engage with the indigenous population as well. So we see kind of a diplomatic offensive there, though again, what fruit that's actually going to bear remains unclear. And as I said earlier, he promises Canadians delegates to Congress if they want them, but Canadians are still going to wait and see how the rest of this campaign unfolds.
Right.
And that essentially is kind of the close there of the Montreal campaign.
Yeah, and then just to finish it off and set up for the next episode, somewhere around this time we start seeing the Arnold expedition arriving in the area as well.
Right. So as maybe a teaser for part two, this is prong one of a two-prong operation. And that second prong was launched from New England through what's now Maine and targeting Quebec City, which is really the strategic key to all of this. And those troops start arriving outside of Quebec around the same time that Montgomery has captured Montreal. And now it's on for Montgomery to bring his veteran troops down the St. Lawrence, link up with the Second American Force, and try and capture Quebec and seal the deal with conquering Canada.
And it's a perfect place to leave off and as you said, tease our next episode. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. This has been terrific. But before we close, it's time for our segment called Huzzah Trivia. So is there some piece of trivia that you can share about the beginning of this Canadian campaign?
So I mentioned the Canadian troops that this guy, James Livingston, was recruiting. And by the end of the Army's time in Canada, they'd actually recruited 2 regiments, so a 1st and 2nd Canadian, which would stay with the Continental Army throughout the whole war, long after the Army had departed Canada.
Oh, wow.
So they eventually get consolidated into just the Canadian regiment. But because it wasn't associated with any one state, the way virtually the rest of the Continental Army was, whereas 1st New York Regiment, 1st Massachusetts Regiment, the Canadian regiments were, after the Army leaves Canada, obviously harder to get Canadian recruits. So to replenish their forces, they were allowed to recruit from any of the colonies. And because of that, in a way, they become the first real American regiment in the Army because they had troops drawn from wherever and were sort of directly provisioned and paid and supplied by Congress. In fact, their nickname was Congress's Own.
Oh, how interesting.
Again, so if we think about the Army as an institution reflective of America, the 1st and 2nd Canadian regiments were sort of the most reflective of the country as a whole.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate your insights today about the beginning of the Canadian campaign and all the initial movements as we approach the Battle of Quebec. And if you'd like to learn more about the American Revolution, the Battle of Quebec, or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on social media at Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.